Welcome to Cosmopolitan Cornbread. My name is Constance. There has been a lot of growth in the channel over the last couple of months, and so I know there's a lot of new people here, and so I just thought I would share a little bit about our history as far as the homesteading lifestyle and just some thoughts. So I did not grow up in the country. I did not grow up homesteading. I grew up in town. I grew up in a place that had a population of about 35,000 or so. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, did live out in the country. She was surrounded by farmers, and I always loved going to her house because, you know, she had all this space and she had fruit trees and a garden and all of this, and I just loved it. I always felt at home when I was going there. And it's funny because as a kid growing up in town, her place seemed so huge, like it was just this massive property, except I look back now and I realize she only had 2 acres. But to a city kid, a town kid, that was a lot, because, you know, we didn't have, while we had a big backyard, we didn't have that much space. So it always seemed huge to me. So even though I didn't grow up in the country, there was always a part of me that knew that that is where I was meant to be. I was meant to be out of town. I wanted to have a garden, and I wanted to have some animals, and it's just, I have my entire life felt drawn to that. We were an active duty Army family for 25 years. I joined the Army right after high school. Met my husband at chapel service in basic training, and we got married, and next thing you know, we're living all over the place. We lived in Virginia, Texas, Germany, Tennessee, Alaska, North Carolina. We lived in neighborhoods, we lived in apartments, and there were a couple of times where we actually had the ability to find a place out in the country that we could rent. And there was in particular a farmhouse that we moved into one time that just stole my heart. It was the first place that we had ever lived in all our years of Army life. The first place that the day we moved in, I felt like I had come home. And that just kind of sealed the deal for me. Now, at the time, I didn't know anything. I did not know anything about gardening. I didn't know anything about taking care of chickens or any of this. And so while we were there, I did put in a garden. It did terrible. It did terrible. And so it kind of motivated me to start researching. And so I began reading books. Now, while we lived there, we did have our first flock of chickens, which was wonderful, having those fresh eggs and all of that. But I still wanted to be able to garden, and so I began reading books and magazines and just devouring all this information that I could. And we lived at that wonderful farmhouse for a couple of years, and then we ended up moving because shortly after we moved in, we met the owner of the home, and we realized he was planning on not renting this forever. He was going to relocate this 100-year-old farmhouse to land where it could stay forever, because that region was going commercial, and then he was going to sell it. And I was heartbroken. I was heartbroken at the idea that now we had finally found this place that felt so much like home that we couldn't stay there as long as we wanted to. But the whole living in the country bug had bitten hard, and we couldn't imagine ourselves living in town if we didn't have to. And so we started keeping an eye out. Once that time frame came where he was talking about putting that house on the market and everything, we started looking for another place out in the country, and we were able to find one. It ended up being good for a while, but then it ended up turning into a nightmare. Bad landlord. I've talked about this in the past. But I was able to get started with my first real garden. And that garden, you know, after I had spent all of this time researching and learning about soil and learning about how to amend it and how to properly grow things, that garden was doing fantastic until we had the nightmare landlord issue, and I ended up ripping out my first successful garden. That broke my heart. So I bought a ton of tubs and pots and dug up everything I possibly could and transplanted it all, everything that I could, and took it with me. We ended up moving into military housing, so we were in a duplex townhome type of place with a little postage stamp backyard. But buddy, my entire backyard was turned into a garden. My patio was covered with containers of herbs and tomatoes, and I even grew corn. And prior to having to move, my corn was taller than the farmer's corn. So it was especially heartbreaking to have to pull it out after the first real success. About a year later, we ended up moving to Alaska, and there really wasn't much you could do in Alaska unless you have a greenhouse. At least not up there in Fairbanks, and that wasn't an option for us. Then we moved down here to Alabama a few years later, and we were again in military housing, but we knew we were going to end up retiring in this area from Army life. And so we stayed on Redstone for a few years. We were there for 3 years, but that gave us the opportunity to learn the area, learn what places we like, what we don't like, what places we'd be okay with living in, and what places we definitely didn't want to. And when it came time for Mr. Smith to prepare to retire, we started house hunting. And we didn't really have a specific place that we wanted to be, but we knew what we wanted. It was more about the land and the opportunity and this, what would be there and give us the chance to do what we wanted than it was about the place. But we just happened to find it in the cutest little town on the planet. So then after the 3 years that we lived at Redstone Arsenal, Mr. Smith retired from the Army and we bought our property. And the first year or so, you know, I didn't really, we were getting established because there was nothing here. There was a house, there was our barn shed, and that was it. It was just land. And there was no garden, there was nothing. And so that first year I was very busy doing things like building our chicken coop, our first chicken coop. And that fall I did till up a little garden plot. Had a little bit of a winter garden with some cabbage and stuff like that. But the spring garden was the first real garden. And it did pretty good. It wasn't great, but I knew it was going to take time because our soil, our property used to be farmland. And I don't know what they grew here. It being northern Alabama, it was probably cotton or soybean or something along that lines. But our soil here was awful, awful. That first year, that first real garden that I put in, you know, we tilled it up. You couldn't hardly find a worm in the soil. And so I knew it was going to take time to build up the soil to have a very successful garden. And that first spring garden, we just started with 2 beds. And like I said, we had some tomatoes and we had some peppers and stuff like that. And it was okay. It wasn't great, but it was okay. Now the next year we expanded it and we put in several beds and we had a good sized garden. We had fenced it all in and it was starting off great. We had corn, we had tomatoes and peppers and squash and all this stuff. And then I had a horrible freak accident and I contracted a very serious illness that knocked me on my butt for weeks. And I didn't have the energy to get out here and work, and I pretty much just had to sit there and watch the weeds and the insects and all that stuff just take over my garden. We were able to harvest some things. There were some things that thrived anyways, but for the most part it was almost a total loss that year. But one of the things that we did harvest was knowledge. We learned that the way we had configured those beds was the wrong way for our beds to be configured, because to water that garden we needed to bring in a water hose, and the direction that we were bringing the hose in from the house was going across the beds, and so we were working against these beds instead of with them. So the following year, last year, we completely reconfigured the garden beds. We tilled up the entire garden area. We put in very specific rows. I lined them with landscaping timbers, and all of the beds were longer and going in the opposite direction. So as we came in with the water hose, we were working with the beds instead of against them. The walkways I seeded with clover, and you can tell exactly where I've seeded it and where I haven't this year. And the intention for that was for the clover to kind of take over and be the walkway, as opposed to the grasses and everything, so that I wouldn't have to mow as often. And so far it's working pretty good. There are some areas where there's still a lot of grass coming up, but ever so slowly that clover is just filling that in. So I love the way that that is turning out. But last year, when we reconfigured those beds, I got an entire dump truck load of compost delivered from a farm here in our area, and I just took load after load out there into those garden beds and just amended that soil tremendously. And last year, when we did the tilling, we were beginning to see some worms in the soil. Not a ton, but there was definitely some there. It was already an improvement from what we had seen in the past. Now this year, because those garden beds are now established, it's no longer being tilled out there. It is a no-till garden. And so what I did this year is I just went out there with a garden fork and I just aerated the soil. I mixed in some compost and it was ready for planting. But when I went through with that garden fork, every time I stuck the fork in the ground and I lifted the soil and moved to the next spot, as I watched, there were worms coming out all over the place. So we started here with basically dead soil. I mean, the grasses could barely grow. And now we're seeing tremendous improvement. It'll take time. I mean, it's still not there yet. It'll take time for this soil to get built up from what it was. But seeing all of those earthworms all over the place was so rewarding, and to know that we're bringing life back to that soil. So last year ended up being an amazing garden. Not only had I put in all of the raised beds, but the in-ground garden was great. I mean, some of the things struggled in the in-ground beds, like the tomatoes. You could definitely see the difference between the raised bed garden and the in-ground garden. But again, that soil's going to take time to improve. But last year was such an amazing garden. There were still things that struggled. There were pests that we had to deal with because we'd had such a mild winter, and I think this year's going to be bad too, because our winter this year was almost non-existent. I think there was like a 2-day cold snap, and that was about it. There wasn't much to it. So I'm sure this year will again be a very hard pest sort of garden season, but it is what it is. There's always things that you're going to struggle with gardening. But I have to tell you that last year's garden, when it was coming to the end of the season and things were starting to die off, but it was still beautiful. There were zinnias and cosmos and peppers and just all of these things in the front garden, the raised bed garden, and in the no-till garden. I knew I had always wanted to garden, but I had no idea how fulfilling it would be and how nourishing to the soul it was. I mean, I would walk out there and it would choke me up. I mean, I would have tears welling up in my eyes over the joy and fulfillment that this garden had brought me. And I have to tell you, I'm not a crier. I don't choke up about things. Sappy movies don't affect me at all because I think they're ridiculous because they just want you to cry. I don't cry about things, but man, I did about my garden. I never realized how much I would love it.